Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today titled How to Take the Friction Out of Board Meetings. My name's Sean McDonald, and I'll be your moderator for the next 45 odd minutes. Firstly, thanks for attending today. We really appreciate the effort you've made to be here for our live event. During our session, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of our screen. We'll be answering these during the session and try to get through as many of these as we have time for. And finally, if you stay through till the end, which we hope you will do, and as is customary for the Board Pro webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering our 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into the draw to win a really nice $400 gift hamper. Well worth hanging around for. Now, for those that know very little about Board Pro, we're a board software provider, sometimes called a board portal. We serve around 20,000 users around 16, 17 countries across the globe. We enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more effectively and efficiently with clever software, less time, and deliver more impact and value for the organization. And as much as we're a board software provider or portal, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. And how we do this is through these webinars, along with the many guides, templates, and white papers we host on our website. Some of the white papers, there is a special paper from Julie Garland, which will be sent to you after the webinar. So sit back and relax and ask questions that will come to you via email shortly. So let me now introduce our wonderful panel for today, starting with Julie. Julie Garland McLennan is one of the very few women to have a portfolio of boards, including chairing an ASX-listed company, and is respected for her practical experience. She is a frequent speaker at conferences and a prized reference for journalists. She has developed and delivered director education for the Governance Institute of Australia, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and leading international institutions. Julie works with company directors and chairs to help them build the success they desire in the boardroom. Good afternoon to you, Julie.
Good afternoon and good morning for those of you who are in different time zones, even good evening for those of you over the other side of the world. Lovely to be here.
Wonderful. Mike Burke is a multi-company director and chair who specialises in helping owners and executives grow organisations. Mike is the managing director of Point 16, a business growth think tank and consultancy charged with unleashing the next generation of business brilliance. They help businesses grow quickly and sustainably through elegant strategy and a next-level management principle. Mike also coaches business owners, management, and C-level corporates on strategy, leadership, management, and workplace performance. Welcome to you, Mike.
Kia ora, thanks, Sean.
Stefan Speller is a motivated and passionate professional with skills gained with central government and a service to the wider community, experience with governance and the machinery of governance, working closely with legislation and policy. Stefan is an enthusiastic leader and team member with a constant drive for personal and collective improvement. Welcome, Stefan.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I shall hand over to you, Julie, and I think you'll want me to release a poll very shortly, won't you?
Yes, I think so. Now, I'm just going to try to share my screen, but you need to stop sharing yours, Sean, so that I can...
I shall do that.
To state the obvious, the real joy of boards is that everything we do together as a group. And that means we have to have meetings, even if they're online or just on the phone. And it means we have to make group decisions. And sometimes we don't quite agree on how or what we're deciding. So that can generate friction. I always say that you need enough friction to get traction, but you don't need so much friction that you can't get movement. How we handle that, and my view is there are 3 times when you get the chance. One is when you're setting the standards for director behavior and how they behave. The second is when you're developing the agendas that will drive your strategic conversations and create the space for them. And the last one is when you're managing discussions. So I made a little poll because there are lots of crying donkeys with no hind legs near me, especially when I get allowed to talk about boards and governance and board effectiveness. So rather than evenly balance it, in the chat, in the poll, just say, which of the three are you most excited about? Do you want to spend most of the time on setting standards or designing agendas or managing discussions? And then I'll try to spend the bulk of our time on that topic, but I will cover the other two as well, so that those of you that voted for them won't miss out either. How does that sound?
Are you seeing these on your screen, Julie?
I can see them on my screen.
Weighted and managing discussions.
I can't see the results yet. All I can see are the topics.
So we have 14% on setting standards, 14% on designing agendas, and 71% managing discussions.
Okay, that's very clear. Oh, now I can see it. You've obviously closed the... So we'll spend most of our time on managing the discussions, and then we will talk through the other two. And Julia in the chat, who could only see the introduction slide, don't worry, that's all you need to see. Hopefully you're now with us. So when it comes to setting standards, I'll spend about 5 minutes on this. When it comes to setting standards, the first chance you have for this is before someone joins your board. And so many people say, oh, you don't need to frighten them with a contract. All you need is a simple consent to act form. And actually, if you behave professionally and if you set a clear expectation that the board will behave in a certain way, and so will all of the directors, doing that at an early stage really sets the scene and sets the standard. So I particularly like to see directors, when they join, and by the way, for those of you that have elections and nominations, you need to get a grip of your nominations process so that you can look at this. I like to see a really clear consent to act form with details about the code of conduct, the fact that it applies to directors as well as staff, with details about how to manage conflicts of interest, all of those things clearly spelled out. Because if you put that in your letter of appointment, it's still hard to enforce, very hard to enforce if they don't comply, but you've clearly established that if you join this board, this is how we want you to behave. Reviewing those conducts and policies and constantly looking at your behavior, rapid feedback when somebody strays over the boundaries, again, reinforcing, practicing. And the final one is being careful that you keep a register so that if you ever find yourselves in an argument with a director as to whether or not they'd agreed to behave a certain way and are now breaking that agreement, that you can actually prove, here's your signed declaration when you joined the company, or here's your signed and returned letter of appointment, which sets out all the policies that you've said you've read and agreed to live up to. So I find that those three things really do set the tone, and they help the chair when you get to the meeting by having everybody pre-prepared and thinking through, if I'm a terrible extrovert, how am I going to handle this? If I'm a very imposing, physically imposing person, how am I going to handle this? Really thinking through, if I have other interests in the industry or in the sector, so that people are primed from the beginning for success. I might throw to Mike and Stefan. What are your views on this?
Yeah, so Julie, I agree wholeheartedly. I think it does start with with setting an example or setting a standard. I think the only thing I would just build on your 3 points there is just as a reminder that the board is simply another team, as you would have a sales team or a marketing team or a finance team. However, they have a very specific role that serves the company, that serves the company's strategy, it serves the company's shareholders, staff, and rest of the community. So just like you would with anybody else, know what role you're looking for, recruit really well, and make sure you set the expectations right at the start and right early, which are just all a different way of building on your 3 points that you have here.
Stefan?
Yeah, I think there's a really good example there. If you don't explain what the process is and the expectations are, you're not going to have people meeting them. And so much of that has to be overly communicated for people to understand it. The other part is, I think, that boundary setting and code of conduct setting really lacks in the NFP sector, not-for-profit and the for-purpose. So just because you've got a board, like Mike said, you're still a team, the same as you are in a corporate. So still put the time into setting those clear standards, even a not-for-profit where you may be volunteering at a time, it's still well worth putting the time in that front end.
Yeah, or perhaps even more worth because it's your time, it's not somebody else's time that you've sold to them. And when your board's behaving badly, it's so easy to say, oh, I've got the wrong directors, but actually you got them. They didn't just pop up like mushrooms in the night. So really think hard. And this is why I say, even as a not-for-profit, you need to think about getting the composition right for your board. You need to think about how big is our board? How big can it be? What are some of the limits? And yes, I agree, Martin, poor behavior is so often a failure of the director selection process. I love the work of Carter McNamara over in America, and he looks at different bases for not-for-profit board composition. And mostly we tend to go for functional or representative boards, and the concept of diverse board where you've got different perspectives and different characters and characteristics is gaining traction, but we're really shoehorning diversity into our functional and representative boards. But Carter opens up this whole area of selecting directors for their passion. And when people really are passionate about the mission, that's when they're really willing to behave in ways that perhaps they wouldn't normally wish to behave. And then the final thing is, it's not just enough to recruit a good director. Even widely experienced directors need induction. It helps them to understand who else is on the board, who's in the management team, because whilst you have the board team, you have the management team, they actually have to come together as a combined team and be able to work. So an induction process is not just a package of things to read. It's actually a series of meetings. It's a process of acquiring information and expertise and developing ability. So I really look at that. And again, if you've got a good board composition, you often have much better friction in your meetings. You have that competition of different ideas and perspectives rather than that destructive friction between different people and different ways of doing things and different ways of behaving. Anything to add from Mike and Stefan before we move on to agendas? Because
The only thing I would add there, Julie, was that having a really good, that chart is really important. I think being able to serve words on a piece of paper makes it objective and not subjective, where friction can come a lot when people die on the hill of their opinion. And typically opinions matter. Opinions are really valuable. That's why you bring a board together. But when you need to clinch it or release the friction, release unconstructive friction and come to a resolution, having a really good thought out charter or purpose that is in writing is really valuable.
Yeah, if it's not in writing, it's very hard to keep it front of mind, particularly when people are forgetting it.
Yes.
Yeah, you can refer back to conversations and agreements, but actually having them written down is much more powerful.
And I know you'll talk to this later, but agreeing at what you have written down is the actual agreement you've both come to. In terms of composition, though, I found it really valuable to have someone that's comfortable to ask what are termed as silly questions. I can't imagine the amount of times or count I've been in a room where someone newer has said, I'm sorry, I don't know what that means. And then half the room says, oh, I didn't either. And we need people like that think differently, that are willing to be, like Mike said, dying on the hill, that kind of putting that whole ego thing to the side and saying, yeah, I'll take the hit for the whole group to understand this concept better.
Yeah, so important. The only silly question really is the one that you didn't ask. And that's the one that can come back and really cause trouble. But asking respectfully and making sure you're asking questions rather than stating, what was it Trump called them, alternative facts? It's a good ploy, isn't it? So getting the right people in the room with the right expectations about how they work. Oh, a beautiful comment in the chat from Megan. I hope it's Megan and not Megan, but if it is Megan, please forgive me. We're currently reviewing our board skills, areas of expertise. Yes, there are a lot of things you can do with your skills matrix. I always like to see a quite rich matrix where alongside the skill, I write the evidence for this skill. Is there a qualification that they've had? Have they worked in this industry? Is it something that they've studied and done? Or is it something that other people say about them? And particularly for things like a passion for the mission or good connections within a sector, it's really nice if your skills matrix captures those things. And for those of you that are listed, yes, you are expected to share a skills matrix, but that doesn't have to be the skills matrix. You can share the minimal one, which just says, here are the skills, here are the directors, and we've written ticks in boxes for who has what, or we've said how many directors have each skill, and you can work it out yourself from their CVs. But for your own internal purposes, a much richer document. And I also like to see on the skills matrix, what are the development things that we have agreed with this director? I hate succession planning. To me, it stinks of, we'll get you in, we'll suck you dry, and then we'll chuck you out and replace you with someone else. And that's not very nice. So I like to see a board, for example, say, we'd like you to come. This is what you bring. This is what you're passionate about. These are the areas you're developing. These are the projects that you'll get exposed to. These are the people that we'll introduce you to. So this is how we're helping you to build your future contribution to other boards and indeed your general life. So I love to see development on the skills matrix, but not so much for public consumption. That's for internal use, but it's a great one. Charters are amazing. There are lots of good charters. You can find them on the internet, or you can email. I'll pop some links in the document that goes around afterwards with a couple of charters that I think are quite interesting. And never think you can cut and paste somebody else's charter, because you just can't. They're individual. They have to be made to fit you. So I said I'd be quick. I'm trying, but it's so much fun talking about this stuff, isn't it? Agendas. I think if you can get rid of 50% of your friction with your choosing of your people and your establishing of their expectations about how they will behave, you can get rid of another 30% with your agendas. A lot of disruptive behavior is actually well-intentioned. And the problem is we don't see the intention, we only see the behavior. But when directors are constantly asking questions about things that you have talked about earlier, or about things that you've got on your schedule for talking about perhaps at the strategy workshop that's coming up, or that have been delegated to another committee, very often that is coming from a genuine desire to be helpful, but just applied at the wrong time. So getting an annual agenda and making sure that this is not seen as boring housekeeping, that this is something that the board understand and agree that this is when we will talk about these issues, because this is when it makes sense. This is when their strategy accretive rather than strategy depletive. And then make sure that each agenda for each meeting really links through to the annual agenda and the strategy. Think about the board's energy and focus. We often put things in order of importance or whether or not there's a decision that has to be made, which is fine. It's a good idea. But if you think about how much energy the board has, we didn't pop that slide in, but in the white paper, there's a graph. And I always say that a board meeting is a little bit like an aerobics class. You want to warm up with some easy stuff, help people get their heads in the right place and think about what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it. And you can see this in the conversation when people first start. It's unfocused, it's scattered, and then they start to gel as a team and come together. That's when you can hit them with the hard decisions, the deep discussions, the challenging ideas. And then you want some easier ideas afterwards so that people could wind down and cool down. There are certain places where you can often hear directors in the lift as they're coming out of their meetings, and they're still talking because they haven't cooled down. But when you get to that page where the board are tired, they've worked hard and they're mentally depleted and exhausted, it's cruel to keep going, but it's also equally cruel to just suddenly stop because their energy levels are wrong. And that's when you tend to get groups, 2 or 3 will go off and they'll still be discussing. And that it again can cause friction because you wind up with a 2-speed board on certain issues, which are the ones that they've continued discussing as they're leaving and afterwards. Steph and Mike, what are your views on agendas and agenda design and strategic alignment?
Oh, first up, I agree wholeheartedly. I think to give a different flavor to it as well is the agenda is like your ultimate facilitator. It can set the tone, it channels the mindset. And so if you do want to go deep on something quite specific, or whether you just want to touch all the points, your agenda and a well thought out and structured agenda can do a lot of the work of facilitation. We talk a little bit about making sure that you have just enough structure. So it's not always not every point or every discussion point is a free for all. One tip we use there is FYI, discuss, decide. So every point or everything that we might be talking about, especially if it's a new agenda item, what you're doing is you're channeling where you want the feedback, where you want constructive conversation. So you do think an agenda isn't just an afterthought and isn't just a nice to have. An agenda can be very much an amazing facilitator in its own right.
Oh, definitely. And I like to see topics move from that FYI through the discussion, through to the decision. And people say, oh, but that must take up so much time. Actually, it saves you time and it improves the quality of the decisions because people are ready and prepared. Just as you can't go to the gym and lift 160 kilos, you have to train for that.
I've noticed you mentioned in your white paper there's a really lazy assumption that people are introverted or extroverted. We don't use that language, but there's far more in that than just that sort of assumption. We sort of stereotype people as this or that. I've seen people that their thought process around a discussion or issue is sometimes days long versus someone who's quite instant, has a whole theory quite quickly. And those two types of people, I think, are a bigger difference than extroverts and introverts in a board. And an agenda, it just allows people that do require that time to really contemplatively think through things, as much as your CEO can get reports to you timely, to have that analysis done, to be that much more equipped for the discussion that you're coming in with. Otherwise, you're going to rush people into a decision. They're not going to ask questions. They're not going to be comfortable, or they're going to agree to things, and you'll get a call the next day.
And that's
about this. Yeah.
And I think getting into brain cycle, blue brain versus red brain type stuff, that's what causes that unconstructive friction. And coming back to Julie's first statement in this presentation is around having the right level of friction. You need friction for traction, but not enough to kill momentum or movement. And I think, that's a very good point, Stefan, around kicking into red brain and just having what we would consider unnecessary friction.
Yeah. And the other part is, Julie mentioned the phrase two-speed, which I think is a real killer sentence in itself. You do end up with these two different groups, and that's where you can have friction, right? But you want it to be universally between all of us, not between two groups. And you don't want to feed into that artificially. And I've always done board meetings with the big chunky topics at the end. And the idea that Julie's putting forward is it's a golden idea. Don't overlook it, please. Try it.
Do aerobics at your next board meeting, Stefan.
Yeah.
Aerobics.
Put it in the middle. Absolutely.
It is interesting because people get grumpy when they get tired. That's our inner 5-year-old coming out to play. But it's very hard to manage a challenging conversation when you're tired. And board meetings should be exhausting. But yes, there's the introverts, the extroverts, there's the thinking fast and slow. There's people who naturally, their focus is historical. Where have we been? What has happened? What brought us to the point we're at? Needing to understand that. And then there are people who are like, well, who cares about that? It's where we're going. We've got to understand that. We've got to get going. So really helping to understand your board and your directors. And this comes down so much. And it's in between the agendas because you design the agenda for the people in the room. And again, another question from Megan about the amount of time for board meetings. It's how long's a piece of string? It depends on your board and on the issues and on the people. But really thinking through what do you need to get done and balancing that annual agenda so that the whole thing comes through and you've scheduled enough meetings of enough duration to not exhaust or deplete your board, but to give you a responsible and reasonable coverage of the issues. There's a lovely question from somebody who wished to remain anonymous about how do we navigate friction in setting an agenda when the CEO wants to block something? And again, that's quite a difficult question to think through. But firstly, look in the mirror. Is the CEO blocking this because they know that you're going to open a can of worms and then you're not going to be able to close it? Is the CEO blocking this because you sometimes ask questions about that topic in a way that is not helpful or respectful, not engaging? Or are they simply blocking it because they don't want to have that conversation? So be really clear, do you need to have this conversation? If you do, then you start thinking about what is up, what assurances do I need to give the CEO about how and when and why. I can remember a few years ago now saying to CEOs, we need to put cyber on the agenda. Oh, we're small, it doesn't matter, it doesn't apply, we're not doing anything. But actually, yeah, I know, but look, let's just have it as an FYI. Let's start getting some information to the other directors about what the standards are evolving to, what they might need to get their heads around. Let's start with that lovely progression from the FYI through to the discussion. And those boards now we're not experts, but we are much better prepared because we've had those discussions in the past. So really important. Yes, I love to have board members indicate their communications and discussion style preferences as part of their induction. Going back to the first one, again, if you've got a CEO who's worried about having things in the board meeting, maybe have them outside the board meeting. Maybe have them as a workshop for board and staff together, but it's not a decision-making forum. Do things to reduce the threat level, particularly of new ideas that are in their own nature challenging. Good idea for board members. Again, this is something you can put on your skills matrix. And there are so many good tools out there. Pick one and get reasonably expert in that. Try not to use 3 or 4. You'll just confuse yourselves. Or at least I confuse myself. I'm not that clever. I can't do 3 or 4 at once.
Julie, we have 3 questions. If I can interject, is it?
Yep.
One from Marcy. Would it make sense to have board meetings indicate their communication discussion style preference as part of their induction to assist in agenda compilation, including papers, graphics and pictures and so forth?
Yes, and that's the one I was answering. I was just saying, I think it's a really good idea. Pick a tool, use the tool, understand the tool, put it on your skills matrix, your internal for our use only skills matrix, and understand, how do you like to communicate? How do you like to meet? What's going to be best for your board? And every time you change a director, you've changed the whole team. So really think through, you need to keep doing these things again and again. The good ones are flexible to how do you behave under stress and not under stress. How do you behave when faced with people of this type or that type? And I really like, although they take a bit more time and effort, I really like those. Marie has a question here. We have a working board and long agendas, 3 to 4 hours long. Do I suggest directors being engaged from part of the association or using someone external? Working board, we all talk about boards as if everybody was an independent strategic governing board, and it ain't so. We have working boards, we have advisory boards, we have executive boards, we have semi-executive boards, we have supervisory boards you'll find sometimes in government sector in particular. So read your constitution and understand how your working board is supposed to work. If your agendas are 3 to 4 hours long, that's probably a lot, particularly if you're a not-for-profit and you're doing this outside working hours. Sean, I might throw to you on this one.
Read it. This is from Deborah Daly. In my experience.
No, I was going back to the previous one about the working board.
It is removed from my screen, I'm afraid.
I can add in.
Answered.
I think it's, and this probably answers the question prior to that as well, just a reminder that the board is simply another team. And so how do they best serve the strategy? If the agenda, and is it best to serve with people working in there versus getting external IP or connections around the table? And in terms of frequency and duration, also challenge the frequency. So if you are connecting once a quarter, is there something to lower the duration and increase the frequency by going monthly, or at least being able to batch some of the content so you don't have to meet to catch up on everything that's happened since the last board meeting? How can you use software or content to reduce that duration? So there are multiple ways of doing that, but do come back to how does that team serve the company? And just like you would with any other team, understanding the composite personalities, whether it's HBDI, Myers-Briggs, any kind of understanding of different skill sets and mindsets will only add value and take you from storming to performing.
And Mike mentioned a shameless plug for Sean here, but software is so useful. We instituted some software around our policy, which actually lines it up for review and makes sure there's a lawyer across it for government reasons, up to date with legislation. And that just allows us to do that work at a much, much more higher level, but a much lower workload. So there's software around that for different types of industries. The other thing is, depending on your board, 4 hours might be appropriate. If it's quarterly, that seems fine. Yeah. The other thing is, use your email function. There's a lot that just doesn't need to be in a meeting that can just be an email. So there's probably a aim for a critical analysis of what we actually have to cover legally in a meeting, what we want to be really confident as a board over, and then what we probably can address separately.
Excellent. We better move on because we're a bit tight. Deborah, I think it is very realistic for decisions if you need to make them between. Use a circular resolution or a flying minute, but use them sparingly and make sure that you've managed that progression of informing the board so that they know that the decision's coming, they know to inform themselves and prepare for it. And always, if you've done one of those, create a space on the next agenda, just in case anybody wants to talk about it. And really think through how you can encourage people to not think of behaviors as binary, not think of them as permanent, their preferences. We can all behave differently. Sean, did you want to comment on Deborah's question as well?
No, all good on my side.
Okay, great. So I love to use some techniques around managing conversations. The first one is, of course, you need a really good chair. You need a chair who has the flexibility to do some things quickly and some things very slowly. You need to encourage active and respectful listening. But as I often say to people when they're presenting to boards, it is the board's job to be interested, but it's your job to be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And that does not mean give the board everything. It does not mean have us drink from the fire hose. It means give us exactly what you think we need. And it is up to the board members to be active in diligent, specific, and independent inquiry into the matters they're deciding upon, so that they also develop and bring their own personal information to bear on the decisions. That's what generates the discussion. Being careful, I actually quite like it. I'm an engineer, so of course, when there's any exciting engineering, I will suddenly forget that I'm a director and start behaving like an engineer. And when management say, Julie, that's getting really technical. And I'm so sorry. I'm just so excited. I'll back down. And very often I find management will say, if you'd like to have a coffee some other day, we could talk. And that's when you know that you've got it right. When management are inviting you and thinking through, I love to use the ladder of inference. It's written up in the white paper. Think it through. It's a ladder that goes right from the pool of available information through the filters that make us choose the information, through to the way in which we then attach meaning to that and then make decisions based on those meanings. It's a really powerful tool. And the dangerous thing is that the solution to any board friction is probably 2 rungs below the place at which you're experiencing the problem. So that constant going back down and agreeing on what you've already agreed and reminding yourselves that we are a team, we've agreed this bit, these are the bits that we're still working on, and this is the information. These are the facts, these are the opinions, this is how we're going, just to really help people think through. I always find that these are the sorts of things that can help you to reduce friction and improve performance. You don't want to reduce it completely. You want to have those differing opinions and that clash of ideas, but you want that to always be positive so that it drives improvement. I might throw, we've only got a couple of minutes, Stefan, and do's and don'ts on asking questions. Can we have another hour, Sean? I have a piece on asking questions. I will pop it into the information that comes to you afterwards. But firstly, never ask more than 3 questions on any one topic. If you haven't got to what you want in 3 questions, management haven't got the answer. They can't find the answer whilst they're there. All you're doing is torturing them. Move on, say thank you, say let's take it offline, but just gently take care with not asking too many questions. I always puke when I see those articles about 50 questions every director should ask about this, that, and the other, because they're written by people who know don't know that you can't ask 50 questions on anything. What you have to do is choose one of those 50. And if the answer's not quite right, maybe ask another one or two just to scope it out a bit more. I like gentle language. I smile a lot, which makes my sharp questions, I hope, slightly less daunting. But everybody has their own style and their own technique. You need to practice yours on the other people that you're on the board with to get it right. And we're all learning. Yeah, it's a journey. Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I think to build on, especially around the questions and also managing really good discussion, is have common language that means something with that team, and whether that's getting to root cause or whether that's this is a 3 out of 10 question, which might mean I need feedback on direction, versus a 7 out of 10 question, which might mean I'm looking for feedback on detail. Having your own vernacular, and again, like to the third point on this conclusion, that continuous improvement. When you found that language may have been tripping people up, confirm language in that boardroom that is specific to that team will help quite a lot, and hopefully get to the heart of asking those questions much easier.
Stefan.
The only thing I'd add there's so much you could have another hour on just difficult discussions, but if you know it's going to be a difficult discussion, again, go back to your agenda setting before you get in there and set a bit of routine about how this is going to work. I'm literally going to go around the entire table, so I want everyone to have an answer, even if it's just super happy with it. And it drags out the introverts that we're being lazy about language again, but it also reins in people who would use that whole time. So again, everyone has to agree to this decision, or at least put their disagreement forward so that we can discuss that rather than running over anyone.
And you don't just have to go around and say, what do you think? What do you think? Because that's sometimes when people are a bit down on something, go through and say, what delights you about this? What's the biggest opportunity hiding in this? Go through and drag out some of those perspectives, because we all have multiple perspectives. We just have the one that we prefer to share. And sometimes getting the shades of gray on the table is a great way for everyone to realize that, no, I'm not black and they're not white. We're all somewhere in the middle here. Let's find out where we want to be together.
Said. So that brings us to almost to the end. Please feel free to connect with any of the team today on LinkedIn, where the details are on screen here. I'm sure they'll look forward to your connection. And if you'd like to be put in touch directly with Julie, Mike, or Stefan, please indicate your interest at the survey at the end of the webinar as you exit. Now, we have a webinar coming up on the 22nd of June, which is going to be a really interesting topic, guiding board meetings to maximize productivity. That will be led by Mike Burke. And the other webinars that we have throughout the year are listed on our webpage, which is in the resource section. So just as you leave the webinar, don't forget to complete our 1-minute survey. Go into the draw for our beautiful gift hamper. We'll announce the winner shortly after the webinar today, and we will send that notification out via email and also with the content, the white paper content that Julie has prepared for this particular webinar, which is a really interesting document. So thanks again for your attendance, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the session today. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on the 22nd of June, as I said, guiding board meetings to maximize productivity. Excuse me. And as I said, that will be led by Mike, with panelists Julie Garland McLennan again, and our own CEO, Brett Herkt. So thanks again, everybody. Have a fantastic day.